Welcome back to r/neighbors from hell, where people share stories about their crazy neighbors. And if you are new to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe to join our amazing community. And without any further ado, let's dive right into the stories. And the first one is titled HOA threatened to sue a pastor over his wheelchair ramp while he was in the hospital recovering from a stroke. My husband has always been a wonderful and sweet man. He is a pastor that hundreds of people seek advice and counsel from. He has the biggest heart I've ever seen in any man, and nothing made my blood boil more than when our neighborhood's homeowners association decided they would put us in a bind. We have lived in this HOA governed neighborhood for about 4 years now, and I will say I don't love it. I mean, the house is beautiful and it is truly my dream home, but this damn HOA is the worst. These people will send letters and fines for just about anything. One time my husband had graduation signs out for our daughter. They were the words "Congrats Kylie" and a few balloons. Well, the party went on for a few hours longer than expected. Daryl, my husband that is, had some friends in from out of town to see Kylie's graduation, so we had some beers and played some cards, and we forgot to remove the decorations from the yard. We slept in for once in our lives and did not get up until around 9 AM or so, and ended up getting around to removing the signs around lunchtime. Well, you bet your butt we had a letter and a fine in our mail the next day from the HOA saying that we broke the rules leaving them up overnight. It is just absolutely silly if you ask me. That certainly was not the only petty offense that they would fine people over. My neighbor had an RV that she rented and kept in the driveway for 24 hours while they were preparing for their trip. They fined her $300 for having an RV and a commercial vehicle because there were signs on it for the rental company on the back of it. So one day something bad happened. My husband suffered a massive stroke and was rushed to the hospital. He had to stay there for several weeks before he could even come home. It was the hardest time of my life, and I had no idea there could even be harder times when the damn HOA decided to make my life even more complicated. They were ready to fine us just for the grass being over a specific height 1 week. My husband had been in the hospital, so I was not home much and did not realize that the grass was getting tall. That is usually my husband Daryl's job. It slipped my mind with him having a stroke and all. Thankfully, Kylie's boyfriend came over and mowed the grass and took care of the other housework. He is a nice boy. This whole time that my husband is in the hospital, I am in communication with nurses and doctors telling me that I have to accommodate the house for his wheelchair. They said that if I didn't have ramps and other things set up for him to get inside and maneuver around, that he would have to stay at a nursing facility. I was not having that. As nice as these people are, I want my husband home with me. I was a nurse for 20 years until I was in a car accident that injured my back. Since then, I have worked from home for a company that does nursing relief. I had to hire a company to come out to the house and quote me for building a ramp up to the front of the house as well as a ramp in the garage. The quotes were expensive and the garage ramp was a no-go because I would not be able to fit both cars inside, which we will be fined if they are left in the driveway overnight. So the front door was the only option. There are several steps leading up to the front of our house and it was going to be a pain, but it would work for a lot of money. We were in a huge pinch at this point. Not only am I worried about the cost of this ramp, but we also had our furnace go out. There was a beautiful light at the end of these troubles, and it was our church. My husband's church where he is a pastor. The people got together for a fundraiser and pulled enough money to pay for the ramp and replace the furnace. I was in tears. I could not believe how generous these wonderful people could be. Meanwhile, we have some creep from the HOA watching us constantly. I did not realize it at the time, but I know it now. We did have a lot of traffic coming and going with nurses' aides to help us get set up, plus the family and friends that were stopping by with food and kind words. They began building the ramp and everything seemed to be looking up. But then one night my husband had another stroke. It was much more mild, but we had to return to the hospital nonetheless. My heart is broken to see him in such a terrible state again, but he always said that he would push forward no matter what, and he did. The ramp goes up, Daryl is recovering slowly again, and the doctors say we can go home. This time it was almost a month in the hospital before we could leave. Everything went pretty well for a little while. About 2 months passed and suddenly we got a strange letter in the mail. It is formal and actually from an attorney. I did not understand. Could this be a mistake? Unfortunately, it was not a mistake. The HOA was suing us for our wheelchair ramp, something about how we had to have prior approval and that it needed to be removed ASAP. I was fuming, and I will tell you all, I'm a nice woman and I rarely use harsh words or take the Lord's name in vain, but damn was I mad. I immediately called my brother-in-law, who is a lawyer, a darn good one too. Andy was quick to tell me that we should be in good shape. He wanted to represent us, but that was a matter of conflict, so he directed us to his partner, who he could somewhat work through. His partner's name was Andre, and he was a very sweet young man who made quick work of the situation. The first thing to look into was the Americans for Disabilities Act, at least on the legal end, and also rally together some neighbors and church friends. Our neighbors were excellent and we had already been communicating with them for help with trash and the grass, trying to keep the HOA off our backs while we were tied up in the hospital. Daryl had always put together a huge Christmas celebration at the hall downtown. Everyone was invited and there was Santa and Mrs. Claus, and don't forget about the reindeer. Not to mention the crazy float that he always put together for the town's Persimmon Festival parade. The kids always follow it, yelling for them to throw them more candy. Let's just say he was a popular guy. We received tons of support from the rest of the neighborhood, and one of our church attendants worked for the local newspaper. Our story quickly gained notice once they were talking about it in town, and the HOA was being shamed in no time. Andrew wrote up a letter informing them of our rights, telling them that we would be taking them to court for their discrimination against a disabled individual. My husband was worried about everything with the HOA, but I kept telling him not to. With all of the help I had received from family and friends, I think that the HOA would back off soon enough. It was only a few days later that I got a phone call from one of the board members. He was apologizing profusely and said that he did not realize what was going on. He goes on to say that there was a petition going around to have the lead board member removed, which was news to me. Apparently, some of the neighbors wanted a change after our issues. This rattled individual continued to apologize and said that he did not want to be sued and that we could keep the ramp. He even said that he never wanted this to happen to begin with. Something about it was another lady that everyone once voted off anyway. Works out for me either way, so I did not care much, as long as they left me and my husband in peace. It turned out that the neighborhood went ahead with removing the lead board member and put someone with more morals in the chair. Daryl has continued to recover and the ramp has served us very well during his progress. I will forever be thankful for all those that helped us, from family and friends to even some strangers. They are really what made this better in the end. The next one is titled Church Drama Story. About 3 years ago, one of my cousins, 30 female, got married. She and her fiancé, 30 male, were not religious. But her fiancé's mother-in-law, was a member of a large conservative evangelical church, so mother-in-law asked them to invite the senior pastor of her church to officiate the wedding. They did, and he agreed to do so. A few months later, a couple of weeks before the wedding, my cousin and her wedding planner met with mother-in-law's pastor. She and her fiancé had written down their own vows, which they would say to themselves, and the preacher was only supposed to say a few standard things like, "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" etc. They discussed the wedding ceremony with him in detail, and he agreed to everything. The only surprise was that the preacher demanded $1,000 to officiate the wedding, which surprised my cousin because he was supposedly a long-time personal friend of mother-in-law, and mother-in-law had told my cousin that he would probably do it for free. Also, according to the wedding planner, this was at least twice or even 3 times the usual fee for a wedding officiant. My cousin gave him a check for $1,000, payment in full and in advance, just to avoid conflict and make mother-in-law happy. 2 weeks later, the wedding rehearsal went according to plan. The preacher did what he agreed to do, no problem. The next day the wedding was held at a beautiful vacation resort that was just a short drive from their hometown. They had about 75 guests. Everything was going as expected when, just before the "I do" part of the wedding ceremony, the preacher announced to everyone present, "This is a bit unusual, but the Lord has led me to say a few words to these 2 kids." He then launched into a sermon bemoaning the decline of traditional marriage, condemning unmarried couples who, like my cousin and her fiancé, had been living together for several years without being married, and then saying that non-Christian spouses like my cousin and her husband were more likely to get divorced, commit adultery, and even physically abuse each other, and he said a lot of other things that just made him sound like a condescending, self-righteous ass. This went on for several minutes. My cousin and her fiancé told him several times loud enough for all of the guests to hear, "That is enough, you need to stop, let's get back to what you agreed to do," etc. About the 4th or 5th time they said this, the preacher responded, "You're going to listen to what I have to say, because I'm the only one here who can officiate this marriage, and I won't marry you if you don't." My cousin has never been the type of person who liked being disrespected, especially by someone she herself had no respect for. 3 years of law school and 2 years as a public defender had sharpened this complete intolerance for people with laser-like intensity. My cousin told the preacher in a voice loud enough to shake the walls of the building, "In our state, according to the law, no wedding officiant is required. We don't need you. We only invited you because my mother-in-law asked us to, and I'm sure she had no idea you were going to do something this stupid." The preacher's face deflated like a punctured tire. He stood motionless for a few seconds and then made one final, silent appeal by staring at the mother-in-law with plaintive, sad puppy dog eyes. Mother-in-law, who was sitting on the front row in the audience, stood up so that everyone could see her and gave him a great big 2 thumbs down. The preacher gave everyone a disgusted look and said, "You can all live in sin for all I care," and stormed out of the building, pushing the best man and all of the groomsmen out of his way as he went, leaving them without anyone to officiate the wedding. My cousin and her husband then ad-libbed the rest of their wedding ceremony without any officiant. They improvised some very loving things to say to each other and said their "I do's," put rings on each other's fingers, and then kissed each other like only newlyweds can. Everyone thought that was the last we could hear from the preacher, but my cousin told me that a few days later she and her husband received a bill from him for another $1,000 in addition to the $1,000 she had already paid to compensate him for the extra services provided. In other words, the wedding sermon they had repeatedly told him not to preach. They ignored the bill for obvious reasons. The preacher then sued my cousin and her husband in small claims court to try to collect the money. My cousin brought all of her evidence to court. Emails between her and the preacher documenting what they had agreed to, video of the wedding showing the bride and groom repeatedly telling him to stop preaching and him leaving in the middle of the service, and a printout of an image of her cancelled check from her bank showing that she had already paid him the $1,000 she had agreed to pay. The preacher's only evidence was his own statement that "the Lord told me to say those things, and these godless fornicators needed to hear them." Everyone in the courtroom had a good laugh, and the judge threw out the case. And ripe stars, I gotta say that I am a huge fan of the subreddit church drama, which we have read many times in the past, but I understand that nowadays it is not really something that is read a lot on YouTube. However, I would love to hear from you what you think about this subreddit, or rather the story that we have read today. Please let me know in the comments. And the next one is titled, "Block Our Driveway, Good Luck Trying to Get Out." This happened to my dad a few years back. We live in a crowded urban area, not in the US, and parking is usually very hard to find. Our house was one of the few around that had a driveway. Since we had 3 cars, dad, mom and my older sisters, parking was never fun. But we always had at least one place to park. There was also a big sign on the garage door saying "Private garage, no parking," so that people wouldn't accidentally block the driveway. One day, as my dad is leaving to go to work, he finds a black Elantra blocking the driveway with its handbrake on. After looking around for 30 minutes for the owner and asking around, he ended up having to take public transportation. He left a note on their windshield saying, "This is the garage of a doctor. Please don't block the driveway as it may put lives in danger," and was on his way. When he came back that evening, the car was gone and his note was crumpled up on the ground. My dad thought nothing of it, but then this happened 2 more times. Every time my dad would leave a note, and every time the note would be left in a crumpled ball in the car's stead. That was until one day my dad was coming back home and found the same car blocking the driveway. That day was special, however, as my mom was parked right in front of them and my sister was parked right behind them. My dad seized the opportunity. He moved my mom's car so that it would just barely touch the Elantra from the front, my sister's car so that it would just barely touch them from the back, and he brought his car and parked it parallel to the Elantra so as to block it from the side as well. All 3 cars had their handbrakes on, there was no way that car was moving an inch. And then, seeing as this was a weekend, my dad decided to stay there, observing from afar and waiting for the owner. About an hour later, 2 women come walking up to the car and, bedazzled by the situation, start asking around for the owner of any of those cars. No one seems to know. They are stuck there for at least an hour until one of our neighbors comes by and tells them that the owner is right there, gesturing to my dad. They walk up infuriated at my dad and yell at him, asking, "Why the hell have you been standing there, leaving 2 women stranded in the street while you saw us trying to get out?" He tells them, "Well, you have been parking in that spot and blocking my car and the driveway for weeks now, and every time I would leave you a note I would find it crumpled up on the floor, so I'm not going to let you out." Their defense: "It wasn't me, it was our stupid driver." Well, okay, let the driver get your car out then. He walks away and goes up to our house. To this day I don't really understand the driver lie, as obviously there was no driver inside, but anyway, I digress. A few minutes later we got a knock on the door. It is our neighbor from a little ways down the road and an acquaintance of my dad's. Turns out the ladies were his mother-in-law and wife, and the mother-in-law would often come around to visit. For some reason she decided our driveway was the best place to park. After much arguments between my dad and neighbor, he finally decides to let them out. To this day we haven't seen the car parked anywhere near our driveway. And the next one is titled "Tear Down Our Fence? Okay, game on." Back when I was younger, maybe 10ish, we lived in the backwoods of Texas along a sort of highway that connected our town to commerce. We lived next to a very grumpy old woman who owned 2 very beautiful boxers. She would let these big dogs out when I and my 5-year-old brother were on the back porch, meaning my protective father brought us inside because the dogs often got through our fence and he wasn't risking having us get hurt. About 2 years before we leave said house, she gets her son to tear down a fence that was a foot onto our land because her yard is not big enough for her dogs. She had apparently sold most of her acre of land to the neighbors on her other side that we were harassing her by keeping her dogs out of our yard where they like to play. So here is the revenge. My dad, who is very well known around town due to his job and being a great person all around, called animal control, specifically a buddy of his who worked in it. They went to the old lady's house, asked for her permit because we were still technically in a county that forbade owning a boxer/pit etc. without permission. She didn't have any, so animal control immediately took the good boys away. Turns out they were also starving and sick. Instead of putting them down, my dad struck a deal with the pound, let him pay for treatment, drops in the bucket to be honest, and get a clarification for our house to own them. Within a month, those 2 doggos were back in our yard with the biggest smiles. Turns out once you feed a good dog, they stop growling and looking at you like a 4-course meal. They refused to go near her yard. They would even go full guard doggo when she stepped on our land. So Dad built a fence again, this time wrought iron with the spikes on top, and when her idiot son once again was told to remove them, he was promptly removed at dog point from our property. Eventually gave the dogs to a family member in a different state because we moved and couldn't take them with us, but we visited often. Wish I could find photos, but we had a house fire about 7 years ago and it pretty much wiped out all our old stuff. And ripe stars, with this we have reached the end of the video. However, if you still cannot get enough of my content, then I would highly suggest to check out my endless binge watch playlist, which will soon show up in the left corner of the screen. In addition, I would really appreciate it if you could not only subscribe to the channel, but also turn on the bell notifications, which you can do by clicking on the little bell icon right next to the subscribe button. This will help my channel tremendously, and this will make sure that you don't miss any of my videos. Furthermore, if you want to see additional ripe content that I don't post on YouTube, then I would suggest to head on over to patreon.com/ripeyoutube for more than 50 exclusive videos that you will not see anywhere else. Thank you so much for your amazing daily support, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.